The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb pressed his back against the crumbling concrete wall, dust from the latest mortar round still settling in his hair. 3 hours into what should have been a routine extraction in the mountains of Afghanistan, his 8-man SEAL team was pinned down by insurgents who seemed to know exactly where they'd be. The intelligence had been wrong. Again. "Viper Base, this is Reaper 6, Webb whispered into his headset, his voice barely audible over the sporadic gunfire echoing through the narrow valley. "Request immediate air support. We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Grid coordinates follow." The response came back cold and mechanical. "Reaper 6, negative on air support. No assets available in your area. Recommend extraction to secondary LZ." Webb's jaw tightened. The secondary landing zone was 3 kilometers through enemy territory. His teammate Rodriguez was losing blood fast from shrapnel in his leg, and their ammunition was running low. The insurgents had them trapped in an abandoned compound with no visible escape route. "Viper Base, we have wounded. Cannot reach secondary LZ without air cover." "Reaper 6, understood your situation, but all air assets are committed to Operation Sandstorm. Hold position and await further instructions." Webb exchanged glances with his team. 20 years of combined combat experience told them what those instructions would be. Wait until nightfall and hope the enemy got bored. But Rodriguez didn't have that long, and the insurgents weren't showing any signs of backing down. That's when they heard it. A low rumble in the distance, different from the helicopters they were accustomed to. Deeper, more deliberate. Webb raised his binoculars toward the ridgeline and saw nothing but empty sky, but the sound was definitely there, growing stronger. "Anyone else hearing that?" whispered Petty Officer Jenkins, the team's youngest member. The insurgent fire had stopped momentarily. Even they had noticed the sound. Then, cutting through the radio static like a knife through silk, came a voice none of them recognized. Female, calm, professional. "Reaper 6, this is Hawkeye 2-7. I show multiple heat signatures surrounding your position. Can you mark friendlies with smoke?" Webb blinked. "Hawkeye 2-7, we were told no air assets available." A pause, then, "Well, I guess someone forgot to tell me that." The voice carried a hint of something that made Webb's chest tighten, not arrogance, but quiet confidence. The kind that came from someone who'd been written off before and proved everyone wrong. "Pop green smoke in 30 seconds, the voice continued. "And keep your heads down, this is going to get loud." Webb fumbled for his smoke grenade, his heart racing with something between hope and disbelief. Major Katerina, Reaper, Volkov had been flying combat missions when most of her male counterparts were still figuring out how to tie their boots. The daughter of a Russian immigrant who'd fled to America with nothing but stories of Soviet aviation, she'd grown up listening to tales of night witches and dawn patrols. Her father had died in a factory accident when she was 12, leaving behind only his service medals from the Soviet Air Force and a promise she'd made to herself that she'd fly higher and hit harder than anyone expected. The A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't pretty, and neither was her reputation. While other pilots flew sleek F-16s and dreamed of air-to-air kills, Volkov had chosen the ugly, slow, heavily armored aircraft that everyone called the Warthog. It was designed to kill tanks and support infantry, and in the hands of someone who understood its brutal efficiency, it was devastating. She'd earned her call sign Reaper, not for the death she'd dealt to enemies, but for the lives she'd saved. 17 successful close air support missions. 43 American servicemen who'd gone home to their families because she'd put steel on target when it mattered most. But the brass still saw her as an anomaly, a competent pilot who'd gotten lucky, flying an obsolete aircraft in an age of precision warfare. Today would change that perception forever. Banking hard left over the Afghan mountains, Volkov could see the compound below through her targeting system. 8 heat signatures clustered in the central building, That would be the SEAL team. Dozens more scattered throughout the surrounding structures, muzzle flashes visible even from 15,000 feet. The insurgents had set up a perfect ambush, but they hadn't counted on the Warthog. Reaper 6, I have eyes on multiple hostiles, marking targets now. Her fingers danced across the targeting computer with practiced precision. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the nose of her aircraft held 1,350 rounds of 13 depleted uranium shells. Each one could punch through tank armor. Against insurgents hiding behind mud walls and rocky outcroppings, they would be like thunder from an angry god. Hawkeye 2-7, friendlies marked with green smoke, came Webb's voice through her headset. Copy that, Reaper 6. Danger close, 100 meters. You boys might want to find something solid to hide behind. She rolled inverted and pushed the stick forward, diving toward the earth at 300 miles per hour. The world outside her canopy became a blur of brown and gray, the targeting reticle painting red dots across her heads-up display. This was the moment that separated pilots from legends, when instinct, training, and raw courage had to merge into something approaching perfection. The first burst from the GAU-8 sounded like the world ending, a deep, guttural brrrrrt that echoed off the mountains and sent shockwaves through the valley. 30 rounds per second, each one precisely placed along the northern wall of the compound, where her sensors showed the heaviest concentration of enemy fighters. The sound alone was terrifying. The effect was devastating. Concrete and stone exploded in great geysers of dust and debris. Bodies disappeared in puffs of red mist. The surviving insurgents who'd been laying down suppressing fire moments earlier were now scrambling for any cover they could find, their coordinated attack dissolving into panicked chaos. Volkov pulled hard on the stick, pulling 7GS as she climbed back up to altitude, her vision graying at the edges but her hands steady on the controls. Below, the compound looked like it had been hit by an earthquake. Reaper 6, how's that? She called, already lining up for her second pass. Webb's voice came back shaky but relieved. Hawkeye 2-7, that was beautiful. We've got movement to the east, looks like they're trying to flank us. I see them. Volkov rolled left, acquiring the new targets. A group of insurgents were moving through a dried riverbed, thinking the depression would protect them from air attack. They were wrong. This time she used rockets. 2 AGM-65 Mavericks dropped from her wing pylons like mechanical birds of prey, their guidance systems locked onto the heat signatures below. The explosions lit up the valley, sending pillars of smoke and flame into the clear mountain air. Movement ceased, she reported dryly. Reaper 6, what's your status? One wounded, stable for now. You just saved our lives, Hawkeye. But Volkov wasn't done. Her targeting system was showing more heat signatures moving through the hills to the south, reinforcements trying to get into position. This wasn't just a random ambush. Someone had planned this carefully, and they weren't giving up easily. She keyed her radio to the command frequency. Viper Base, Hawkeye 2-7. I have eyes on approximately 30 enemy fighters moving to reinforce the compound. Request permission to engage. The response came back cold and disapproving. Hawkeye 2-7, you were not authorized to engage. Return to base immediately. Volkov looked down at the green smoke still rising from the compound where 8 American servicemen were fighting for their lives. She thought about the by-the-book colonels sitting in air-conditioned command centers, making decisions based on risk assessments and political considerations rather than the reality of combat. Viper Base, I'm having radio troubles. Say again. She switched off the command frequency and focused on the tactical channel where Webb could hear her. Reaper 6, looks like I've got some time to kill up here. Mind if I stick around and make sure nobody else crashes your party? The relief in Webb's voice was palpable. Hawkeye 2-7, we'd be honored to have you. For the next 40 minutes, Major Katerina Volkov turned the mountains of Afghanistan into her personal hunting ground. Every insurgent who showed himself became a target. Every muzzle flash became coordinates for another strafing run. She used every weapon in her arsenal with surgical precision: cannon rounds for individual fighters, rockets for groups, and her vast experience to anticipate where the enemy would move next. The insurgents had never faced anything like this. They were used to American air power coming in fast and high, dropping bombs from altitude and leaving. But the A-10 was different. It could loiter, waiting patiently like a predator, then strike with devastating accuracy before climbing back up to do it again. By the time she was done, the valley was quiet except for the distant sound of approaching helicopters. The extraction birds that command had finally authorized were coming in to pick up Webb's team, flying through airspace that was now completely secure thanks to one pilot who decided that following orders was less important than bringing people home. "Reaper 6, your ride's here," Volkov called as she watched the MH-60's flare for landing near the compound. "Roger that, Hawkeye. How do we say thank you for something like this?" Volkov smiled inside her oxygen mask, watching the small figures of the SEAL team moving toward the helicopters, carrying their wounded teammate between them. "Just get home safe, gentlemen. That's thanks enough." As the helicopters lifted off with their precious cargo, she banked toward base, knowing that a very unpleasant conversation with her commanding officer was waiting for her. But for the first time in months, she didn't care about the politics or the career implications. 8 American servicemen were going home to their families tonight, and that was the only metric that mattered. The flight back to Bagram Airfield gave Volkov time to think about what she'd just done. Disobeying direct orders was a court-martial offense. Engaging enemy forces without authorization could end her career. The fact that she'd been successful wouldn't matter to the colonels who valued procedure over results. But as she watched the sun setting over the Hindu Kush Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. This was why she'd become a pilot. Not for the medals or the recognition, but for moments like this when skill and courage could make the difference between life and death. Her radio crackled. "Hawkeye 27, Bagram Tower, you're cleared for landing runway 27. Colonel Morrison wants to see you in his office immediately upon landing." "Copy that, Bagram. Hawkeye 27 inbound." Colonel James Morrison was waiting in his office when she knocked on the door an hour later, still wearing her flight suit and carrying her helmet under her arm. He was a career officer who'd spent more time behind a desk than in a cockpit, and his expression made it clear that he was not happy. "Major Volkov, sit down." His voice was ice cold. "I've just received a very interesting report from Viper Base about an unauthorized engagement in Sector 7. Care to explain?" Volkov met his gaze steadily. "I provided close air support to a SEAL team under heavy fire, sir. Without authorization, after being explicitly told no air assets were available. 8 American servicemen were about to be overrun, Colonel. I had the capability to help them." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of a man trying to decide between a reprimand and a court-martial. "Major, we have rules and procedures for a reason. You can't just freelance whenever you feel like it. What if there had been civilians in that compound? What if you'd hit friendly forces?" "There weren't civilians, sir. My thermal imaging was clear, and I had positive identification on friendly positions before I engaged." "That's not the point, Major. The point is that you deliberately disobeyed a direct order." Volkov remained silent. There was nothing she could say that would change his mind about the importance of following procedure, and nothing he could say that would change her mind about the importance of saving lives. The silence stretched between them until Morrison's phone rang. He answered it with visible irritation. "Morrison," a pause. "Yes, sir, she's here now." Another pause, longer this time. "I understand, sir." He hung up and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That was General Patterson at CENTCOM. Apparently, Lieutenant Commander Webb filed a very detailed report about today's action. He credited you with saving the lives of his entire team. Volkov waited, knowing there was more coming. The general wants to recommend you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The words hung in the air like smoke from a spent shell casing. Morrison clearly wasn't happy about this development, but military politics was a complex game, and sometimes even by-the-book colonels had to acknowledge results. However, Morrison continued, I want to make one thing absolutely clear, Major. This was a one-time exception. In the future, you will follow orders and stay within authorized parameters. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Dismissed. As Volkov walked across the base toward her quarters, she passed the flight line where her A-10 sat parked among the more glamorous fighters and bombers. The aircraft looked tired and worn, its gray paint faded from countless missions and its armor scarred from flak and small arms fire. But it was still flying, still fighting, still bringing people home. Just like her. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony took place 3 weeks later in a hangar at Bagram, with most of the squadron in attendance and a few reporters from Stars and Stripes to document the event. General Patterson flew in from Qatar to present the award personally, making a speech about courage under fire and the importance of close air support in modern warfare. But the moment that mattered most to Volkov came afterward, when Lieutenant Commander Webb approached her near the buffet table, where she was trying to avoid the crowd of well-wishers and congratulators. Major Volkov, he was wearing his dress blues, looking uncomfortable in the formal setting but determined to say something. I don't think we were properly introduced the other day. She smiled. I believe we were a bit busy at the time. Yes, ma'am, I just wanted to say, what you did up there, that wasn't just good flying. That was something special. You didn't just save our lives, you saved our mission. Rodriguez is back home with his kids because of you. Webb extended his hand and she shook it firmly. It's what we do, Commander. We look out for each other. Yes, ma'am, but not everyone would have made the choice you made. Not everyone would have risked their career for 8 guys they'd never met. As Webb walked away, Volkov realized that something had changed. The other pilots were looking at her differently now, not with the polite tolerance she'd grown used to, but with genuine respect. The kind of respect that had to be earned in combat, one mission at a time. Her call sign wasn't a joke anymore. She was Reaper, the pilot who brought death to enemies and life to friends, who could put steel on target when it mattered most, who would break rules to save lives and face the consequences without flinching. The months that followed brought more missions, more close calls, more opportunities to prove that the ugly, slow A-10 and its underestimated pilot were exactly what American ground forces needed in the mountains of Afghanistan. Volkov flew support for Army Rangers, Marine reconnaissance teams, and Special Forces operators who began specifically requesting her by call sign. Get me Reaper became a common request on the tactical channels. If Reaper's available, we can do this mission. The respect spread beyond just the ground forces. Other pilots began seeking her advice on close air support tactics. Maintenance crews took extra care with her aircraft. Even the by-the-book colonels started treating her opinions with the weight they deserved. But it was the letters that meant the most. Handwritten notes from servicemen she'd supported, sometimes months after the missions. Photographs of weddings and children and family reunions that wouldn't have happened without her intervention. A Purple Heart medal sent anonymously with a note that simply said, "Thank you for bringing me home." Late at night, when the base was quiet and she couldn't sleep, Volkov would sit in her quarters reading those letters and thinking about her father. The Soviet pilot who dreamed of flying but ended up working in a factory, who'd filled his daughter's head with stories of aviation heroics and impossible victories against overwhelming odds. She wondered if he'd be proud of what she'd become, if he'd understand that the real victory wasn't in the medals or the recognition, but in the knowledge that when people needed her most, she'd been there. The war eventually wound down, as wars do. Operations became less frequent, and the urgency that had defined her tour in Afghanistan began to fade into routine peacetime training. Volkov rotated back to the States, to a desk job at the Pentagon that felt like exile after years of combat flying. But her reputation had preceded her. Young pilots sought her out for guidance. Military historians interviewed her about close air support doctrine. Defense contractors wanted her input on the next generation of ground attack aircraft. The little girl who'd listened to her father's aviation stories had become someone else's inspiration. The pilot who'd been written off as a competent anomaly was now setting the standard for what combat aviation could achieve when skill, courage, and determination converged at exactly the right moment. Years later, when military historians wrote about the Afghanistan conflict, they would note that the most decorated A-10 pilot of the war hadn't been the loudest or the most political or the most connected. She'd been the one who understood that in the end, military aviation wasn't about the aircraft or the weapons or the technology. It was about people, the people on the ground who needed help and the people in the sky who were willing to risk everything to provide it. It was about the promise that when Americans were in trouble in some remote corner of the world, someone would come for them. Someone would cut through the radio silence, break the rules, and put steel on target until everyone came home. Major Katerina, Reaper, Volkov had kept that promise 8 times in a single afternoon in the mountains of Afghanistan. But more importantly, she'd inspired a generation of pilots to understand that keeping that promise was the only thing that really mattered. The sky had always been her sanctuary, but now it was also her legacy. Every time a young pilot chose the difficult mission over the safe one, every time someone broke protocol to save lives, every time courage overcame bureaucracy in the service of bringing people home, a little bit of that legacy lived on. In the end, that was worth more than all the medals in the world. It was worth the risk, the career consequences, the sleepless nights, and the weight of responsibility that came with having the power to make the difference between life and death with the pull of a trigger. The SEALs had said no air cover was coming, but Reaper had come anyway, cutting through radio silence like she'd cut through enemy fire, with precision, determination, and the absolute certainty that some things were more important than following orders. And in that moment, high above the Afghan mountains with 8 lives hanging in the balance, Major Katerina Volkov had proven that sometimes the most important victories are won not by those who follow the rules, but by those who understand when the rules matter less than the mission. The legend of Reaper was born that day, forged in combat and tempered by consequence, but it would live forever in the skies where courage still mattered more than politics, and where the promise to bring everyone home was still worth everything a pilot could give.